She buried her husband 2 years ago. He buried himself in running. One whispered word brought them both back alive.
Subscribe to Wild Sky Stories. Turn on the bell icon so you can do not miss any new video.
The dust rose behind his horse like a ghost following him into town, the way ghosts had followed him for the past 7 years. Caleb Marsden pulled his worn hat lower against the dying sun and guided his mare toward the only light still burning on the edge of Redstone Creek. A small farmhouse sat crooked against the horizon, its white fence leaning like an old man tired of standing. He had not intended to stop. He never intended to stop anywhere for long. But his horse was limping, and the night was coming fast, and somewhere deep in his chest, a weariness had settled that no amount of riding could shake loose. The woman appeared on the porch before he reached the gate. She held no lantern, but the light from the window behind her painted her silhouette in gold. Her dress was simple, dark as morning, and her hair fell in waves the color of autumn wheat, loosely braided over one shoulder. "Evening, ma'am," Caleb said, his voice rough from days without speaking. "My horse threw a shoe about 3 miles back. I don't mean to trouble you, but I wondered if you might have a barn where she could rest until morning. I can pay." The woman studied him with eyes that had seen too much, eyes that belonged to someone who had learned that life takes more than it gives. She was younger than he had first thought, perhaps 30, but grief had drawn fine lines around her mouth that should not have been there. "There's a barn around back," she said, "and there's stew on the stove if you're hungry. A man shouldn't ride on an empty stomach." Caleb hesitated. Kindness from strangers always made him cautious. In his experience, everything came with a cost, and he had already paid more than most men could afford in one lifetime. "That's generous of you, ma'am. It's practical," she corrected. "I've got more stew than I can eat alone, and winter's coming. No sense in waste." Her name was Clara Holloway, and she had been a widow for 2 years. Her husband had been a rancher, a good man by all accounts, killed when his horse spooked during a thunderstorm and threw him against the rocks by Miller's Creek. She told Caleb this over dinner, not with the dramatic sorrow of someone seeking sympathy, but with the quiet acceptance of a woman who had already wept all her tears and found that life demanded she keep breathing anyway. "You run this place alone?" Caleb asked, looking around at the modest kitchen, the walls lined with dried herbs and the shelf cluttered with jars of preserves. "The Mac Cullah boy helps sometimes. Fixes fences, tends to the heavier work when I can afford to pay him." Clara ladled more stew into his bowl without asking. "Mostly, it's just me, Bar. That's a hard way to live, Bar." "Living is hard," she said simply. "The way you do it is just details." Something cracked open in Caleb's chest at those words, something he had kept locked away since the war, since the blood and the screaming and the things he had done that still woke him in the darkest hours. He looked at this woman with her tired eyes and her steady hands, and he saw someone who understood that survival sometimes meant carrying weights no one else could see. That night, he slept in the barn as agreed, his bedroll spread across clean hay that smelled of summer. But sleep came hard, as it always did. The dreams found him again, the faces of men he had killed, the sound of his brother's last breath rattling through him like a curse. When he woke with a shout caught in his throat, the barn was dark, and his heart was beating against his ribs like a caged animal. He walked to the fence and leaned against it, staring up at stars so bright they seemed close enough to touch. The night was cold, and his breath misted in the air. Nightmares? He turned to find Clara standing a few feet away, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders and her feet bare against the cold ground. "Didn't mean to wake you, ma'am." "You didn't. I don't sleep well either." She came to stand beside him, close enough that he could smell lavender and wood fire. Thomas used to say that some people carry their battles inside them. He said you could always tell a man who'd seen war by the way he slept. Your husband was a wise man. He was. Clara looked up at the stars. He also said that carrying something alone doesn't make you strong, it just makes you tired. Caleb said nothing. There was nothing to say. She was right, of course. He was tired in a way that sleep would never fix, tired in his bones and his soul, and somewhere deeper still. The next morning his horse was still limping. Clara suggested he stay another day, let the mare rest proper before moving on. He knew he should refuse. He knew that staying in one place too long led to attachments, and attachments led to pain. But the smell of coffee drifted from the kitchen, and Clara was all ready, walking toward the chicken coop with a basket under her arm. And somehow, he found himself staying. One day became two. Two became a week. He fixed the fence she could not afford to have the Mac Cowboy repair. He mended the loose boards on the porch that had been threatening to give way since before Thomas died. He replaced the cracked window in the barn and patched a leak in the roof of the main house, climbing up in the early morning when the air was still cool and the world was painted in shades of pink and gold. Laura watched him work with an expression he could not read. Sometimes she brought him water or sandwiches thick with fresh bread. Sometimes she simply sat on the porch with her mending and glanced up at him every few minutes, as if making sure he was still there. They talked in the evenings, sitting on that same porch as the sun went down. She told him about her childhood in Missouri, about the wagon journey west with her parents, about meeting Thomas at a church social when she was 19, and knowing immediately that he was the man she would marry. "Did you ever regret it?" Caleb asked one evening. "Coming west?" Laura considered the question. "No, I regret that it ended too soon. I regret that I never got to grow old with him, never got to see our children running through that field." She nodded toward the empty expanse beyond the fence. "But I don't regret the living we did while we had it. That's the thing about love. Even when it leaves you hollow, you don't wish you'd never felt it." Caleb thought about that long into the night. He had loved once, years ago, a girl named Rebecca with laughing eyes and promises of forever. But the war had taken him away, and when he returned she had married his best friend, unable to wait for a ghost who might never come home. He had not blamed her. How could he? He had come back a different man, harder and darker and full of shadows. The boy she had loved was buried somewhere on a battlefield in Virginia, and what remained was something not worth loving at all. 2 weeks after his arrival, Clara's milk cow fell ill. Caleb stayed up with her through the night, taking turns applying poultices and forcing medicine between the animal's stubborn teeth. Toward dawn, when the cow finally stopped thrashing and fell into peaceful sleep, they sat together in the hay, exhausted and covered in muck. Clara laughed, a sound so unexpected that Caleb turned to stare at her. She looked at him with hay in her hair and mud on her cheek, and she laughed with the pure release of someone who had forgotten. "How? We must look a sight," she said. "You look beautiful." The words escaped before he could stop them. They hung in the air between them, honest and vulnerable and terrifying. Clara's laughter faded, replaced by something softer, something that made Caleb's heart clench with a feeling he had thought long dead. "Caleb," she whispered, "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have said that. Don't." She reached out and touched his hand, her fingers cold but her grip firm. "Don't apologize for truth." That night, when they walked back to the house, their shoulders brushed with every step. When they reached the porch, Clara turned to him, and for a long moment they simply looked at each other. "Your horse is healed," she said quietly. "I know. You could leave tomorrow if you wanted. I know." Clara nodded slowly. Something flickered in her eyes, something like hope and fear tangled together. "Good night, Caleb. Good night, Clara." He did not sleep at all that night. The next morning, Caleb saddled his horse. He loaded his few belongings into his saddlebags and checked the mare's shoes one final time. She was ready. She was more than ready. They could make the border by sunset if they rode hard. He led the horse to the front of the house and found Clara waiting on the porch, her arms wrapped around herself despite the warmth of the morning sun. She had not braided her hair, and it fell around her shoulders like honey and fire. "Thank you," she said formally, her voice steady, "for everything you did, for staying when you didn't have to." Caleb gripped the reins so hard his knuckles turned white. It was nothing. It wasn't nothing. Her voice cracked, just slightly, a fracture in her composure. It was the first time in 2 years this house felt like a home instead of a tomb. He mounted his horse because he did not trust himself to stay on the ground. From the saddle she looked smaller, more fragile, though he knew she was the strongest woman he had ever met. Take care of yourself, Clara Holloway. You too, Caleb Marsden. May your road be gentle. He turned the horse toward the gate. He made it 10 feet before he stopped. The morning was beautiful. The sky stretched blue and endless, full of the promise of new horizons and fresh starts. The road led away from this place, away from the woman standing on the porch with her heart in her eyes, away from the danger of feeling something again. He had spent 7 years running from the from his memories, from the ghost of the man he used to be. He had told himself that movement was freedom, that staying still meant vulnerability, that a man without roots could never be pulled up. But what was the point of freedom if you spent it alone? Caleb turned back. Clara had not moved. She stood frozen on the porch, one hand pressed against her heart, watching him with eyes that shimmered with unshed tears. Clara, yes? He dismounted slowly, his boots hitting the ground with a finality that felt like coming home. He walked back to the porch, back to this woman who had offered him stew and kindness and the first peace he had known in years. I've spent 7 years running from my past, he said, his voice rough. I've slept in 100 barns and ridden through 1,000 towns. I've been so afraid of staying that I forgot what I was running toward. He stopped at the bottom of the steps, looking up at her. I don't know how to be a farmer. I don't know how to build a life. I'm carrying more darkness than any man should ask a woman to share. I'm not asking for perfection, Clara whispered. I'm asking for presence. I might have nightmares every night for the rest of my life. Then I'll be there when you wake up. I might not be able to give you children. I might not be able to give you anything except 2 broken hands and a heart that doesn't work quite right anymore. Clara walked down the steps until she stood before him, close enough that he could see the flecks of gold in her brown eyes. I had a perfect love once, she said softly. It was beautiful and gentle and exactly what a young girl dreams of. But I'm not a young girl anymore. I'm a woman who knows that love doesn't have to be perfect to be real. It just has to be willing. Caleb reached out and touched her face, his rough palm cradling her cheek like she was something precious. She leaned into his touch, and something inside him that had been broken for so long began, slowly, to mend. Stay, Clara whispered. Please stay. The sun climbed higher in the sky. Somewhere in the distance, a meadowlark sang its morning song. The world kept turning as it always did, indifferent to the small miracles happening in its corners. Yes, Caleb said, the word feeling like both an ending and a beginning. I'll stay. That evening, they sat together on the porch and watched the sun go down. Clara's head rested against his shoulder, and his arm wrapped around her waist, and for the first time in 7 years, the silence inside him was not empty, but full. There would be hard days ahead, winters to survive and fences to mend, and the slow, patient work of building a life from the ruins of old ones. There would be nights when his demons came calling and mornings when her grief felt fresh again. They would have to learn each other, with all their rough edges and hidden wounds, and choose each day to stay when leaving would be easier. But when night fell over the little farmhouse on the edge of Redstone Creek, there were 2 figures on the porch instead of 1, and when Clara whispered, "Please stay," Caleb answered the only way he knew how. He did, and in staying, he finally found his way home. The seasons turned, as seasons do. Snow came and went, spring painted the fields in wildflowers, and on a warm evening in June, Clara and Caleb stood before the 2WN preacher and spoke vows that meant everything, because they had both learned what it meant to lose. When people asked him later how he had ended up in Redstone Creek, Caleb would tell them about a lame horse and a widow's kindness. But in his heart, he knew the truth. He had been running all his life until he found someone worth standing still for, and she had been waiting for someone brave enough to stay.